Important questions and answers for the Cold War era. 1. What is the meaning of the Cold War? Explanation. The Cold War, 1945-1991, was an era of geopolitical tension between the USA and USSR. It was characterized by ideological rivalry, where the US promoted capitalism and democracy, while the USSR supported communism and socialism. Example: the division of Germany into capitalist West Germany, backed by the US, and communist East Germany, controlled by the USSR, symbolized the Cold War divide. The Berlin Wall, 1961-1989, was a literal and ideological barrier between these two systems. 2. What were the main features of the Cold War? Explanation. Bipolarity. The world was divided into two blocks led by the USA and USSR. Military alliances. NATO, 1949, was led by the US, and the Warsaw Pact, 1955, was the USSR's response. Arms race. Both sides stockpiled nuclear weapons, leading to a balance of terror. Proxy wars. Conflicts like the Vietnam War were fought indirectly. Non-aligned movement. Many countries, including India, chose not to align with either superpower. Example: the Korean War, 1950-1953, highlighted this divide, as North Korea was supported by the USSR and China, while South Korea was backed by the US and UN forces. 3. What was the role of NAM during the Cold War? Explanation. NAM, Non-Aligned Movement, was a group of countries that avoided aligning with either superpower. Leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru, India, Tito, Yugoslavia, and Nasser, Egypt, played a key role in founding NAM. Objectives: maintain sovereignty and avoid becoming pawns in the Cold War. Promote peace, disarmament, and economic development. Example: India under Nehru avoided joining military alliances like NATO or the Warsaw Pact and promoted peaceful coexistence through diplomacy. 4. What do you understand by proxy wars during the Cold War? 4. Give examples. Explanation. Proxy wars were conflicts in which superpowers indirectly supported opposing sides without fighting directly. These wars allowed the USA and USSR to compete without risking direct confrontation. Example 1. In the Vietnam War, 1955-1975, the USA supported South Vietnam against the Communist North Vietnam, which was backed by the USSR and China. Example 2. In Afghanistan, 1979-1989, the USSR supported the Communist Afghan government, while the USA armed the Mujahideen resistance fighters. Long answer questions, 6-8 marks. 1. Explain the factors that led to the end of the Cold War. Explanation. The Cold War ended due to several reasons. Economic decline of the USSR. The USSR could not keep up with the USA's military spending due to a stagnant economy. Example: the USSR's heavy expenditure on the arms race, including the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, drained resources. Reforms by Gorbachev, Perestroika, economic restructuring, introduced market-like reforms. Glasnost, openness, allowed political freedom and criticism of the government. These reforms weakened the communist ideology. Collapse of Eastern European regimes. Soviet-controlled countries like Poland and Hungary moved away from communism. Example: the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 symbolized the collapse of communist regimes in Eastern Europe. Disintegration of the USSR, 1991. The USSR split into 15 independent republics, marking the end of the Cold War. Example: Russia became the largest successor state, and the Cold War's bipolarity gave way to unipolarity led by the USA. 2. Describe the Cuban Missile Crisis as an example of Cold War tension. Explanation. The Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, was a confrontation between the US and USSR over Soviet missiles in Cuba. It nearly brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Background. Cuba, under Fidel Castro, became a communist ally of the USSR after the 1959 revolution. The USSR placed nuclear missiles in Cuba to counteract US missiles in Turkey. Crisis. The USA, led by President John F. Kennedy, demanded the removal of Soviet missiles. For 13 tense days, the world watched as both sides prepared for potential war. Resolution. The USSR agreed to remove missiles from Cuba. The USA pledged not to invade Cuba and secretly agreed to remove its missiles from Turkey. Example of impact. The crisis led to the establishment of the Hotline Agreement between the US and USSR for direct communication to avoid future crises. 3. How did the superpower rivalry impact the newly independent nations? Explanation. Superpower rivalry greatly affected newly independent countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Alignment pressures. Nations were pressured to join either the US or USSR bloc. Example. Pakistan joined US-led alliances like SEATO and CENTO, while India chose non-alignment. Proxy wars. Superpowers funded and armed different groups within these nations, leading to prolonged conflicts. Example. Angola's Civil War, 1975-2002, saw US and Soviet-backed factions fighting for control. Economic dependence. Developing nations often relied on aid or military support, compromising their sovereignty. Example. Egypt received significant military and economic aid from the USSR before shifting to US support after 1973. Non-aligned movement, NAM. NAM helped these nations maintain independence and avoid superpower domination. Example. India's role in the Bandung Conference, 1955, emphasized decolonization and cooperation. Key takeaways. Use examples like the Korean War, Vietnam War, Cuban Missile Crisis, and NAM conferences to illustrate your answers. Ensure you write structured responses, especially for long answers, by dividing them into introduction, body, and conclusion. For short answers, stay concise but impactful with 2-3 relevant examples.